Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. You know, on this channel, we have a pledge to bring you the best and the brightest voices. And recently, I was attacked on Twitter by a certain political analyst who says, I've invited Mmusi Maimane like 500 times, but I haven't invited her to SMWX. So, in order to rectify this oversight, I am bringing you a development consultant, scholar, and analyst of the highest repute, Tessa Dooms. Thanks so much for joining us on SMWX.
Thank you for allowing me to bully you. It's really good to be here.
Great. Well, what it means is that you watch SMWX, so that means we must be doing something right.
Definitely, I definitely do. I'm really appreciative of the platform as well, because I really think that the need to have spaces that are not curated by a whole lot of interests that are not seen is really, really important. And the fact that it's a young space is even more important. So appreciate it.
Appreciate you being on. And well, this long weekend that we're just coming out of was not short of drama as usual in our beloved country, and I wanted to get straight into asking you about Tony Leon. Tony Leon does an interview about his forthcoming, or his just recently released book, in which he states that Mmusi Maimane was a, quote, failed experiment. Discuss for 50 marks.
Well, wow. I mean, how can one be so surprised and unsurprised by something at the same time? I mean, I think many people have said this in the last few days, that Mmusi should not be surprised by the kind of views that Tony Leon holds. I think we've all seen the DA treat Black representation as an experiment. And it's the only way in which they actually engage race as a party. And I do think of Tony Leon as part of the DA, even in its current form. We should never think that the DA is only what we see on the front end. It's one of those parties where the back end is very hard to get into, and that's intentional because there are many Tony Leons at the back end of the DA that drive the agenda, that drive the way things happen. And so when a Tony Leon speaks out, it's not coincidental, it's not divorced from the DA itself. It's very much a reflection of what's happening inside the party. And the party has decided to engage with race as a purely superficial thing. They've decided that it's not in their interest as a party to think about race as a substantive part of the South African landscape. So they think of it as something that's window dressing, something that is part of their PR machine. And we've seen Mmusi is probably the most obvious example of the ways in which they are, using race as a PR mechanism, while they, and we saw this in their last policy conference, are adamant that race is not a substantive issue, that they want to do away with race. They want to, hide it as far as possible when we're talking about what really matters in this country, what really are the drivers of development, what are the drivers of poverty, inequality, the potential drivers of success. They don't want to talk about race then, but when it comes to the PR and the campaigning and putting a face to things, they know that race matters then. And so it's not surprising that this is the way in which they're engaging. It's not surprising that they think of it as something that can be an experiment. They think of identity as something that can be an experiment. And it's truly unsurprising that, as Mmusi rightfully says, that they don't think that this is an affront on somebody's dignity to, basically make somebody an object of their own kind of political wranglings within the party. It's really sad, but really unsurprising.
One of the things that I constantly hear, which I think people need to push back on, is that the DA is, quote, tone deaf, right? And I'm like, no, they're not tone deaf. They know exactly what tone they're striking. They love the sound of that tone. The problem is not with their ears. The problem is with their ideology and their belief system, which is deeply misguided and deeply harmful. So I feel like people give the DA a pass by saying like, oh, they know not what they do, when for the better part of 3 decades, they've known very well what they've been doing.
Yeah, the DA is very intentional. It's a very well-run big blue machine. Don't get it twisted. And it's got many layers and many intentional ways in which it runs itself. And so, no, you're absolutely right in the idea that they're not tone deaf. And they really actually believe, and this is the one thing I will, to their credit, say, they believe that they can create a South Africa based on the tone that they are setting. Rightfully or wrongfully, they really do think that the South Africa that they want to create is the right version of South Africa. And that's the thing that we need to take on. We need to say, is what the DA stands for, is who it represents and what it represents, what South Africa needs. And the DA is intentional about who it listens to. When it wants to listen, it listens very hard. It's not by accident that you saw the DA fly themselves out to Stellenbosch and talk about Afrikaans and language issues. In the same week that Fees Must Fall was happening in Johannesburg and young people were getting shot for free education, something they didn't make a peep about. They made choices. They're making choices all the time. And the truth is that they're choosing to ignore the plight of the majority of Black South Africans in this country who are young, who are every day facing poverty, every day facing inequality, every day facing the very thing they don't want to talk about, the effects of racism. And they've just decided that that's not where they're going to focus their efforts, because that's not the version of South Africa they want to deal with. And I mean, many people have spoken about this. I think Kgosi Chikane is probably the person who says it the most, that we do live in at least two South Africas. And you as a person, as a political party, as an organization, as a government, even as a private corporation, you can decide which South Africa you want to live in. You can decide which South Africa you want to deal with. And for the most part, the DA has decided to deal with a white middle class, somewhat Black middle class South Africa. And that's the South Africa they want, the South Africa they're interested in, and the only South Africa they see.
You know, it struck me when I was reading this News 24 interview. I'm afraid I'm not going to subject myself to the book. But another thing that actually was probably even more incendiary for me was Tony Leon suggesting that policies of affirmative action and Black economic empowerment, imperfectly implemented as they have been and troublesome as they are, probably because they don't go far enough, in my view, could somehow be equated to and are tantamount to what the National Party did with its system of totalitarian racial classification. And, you know, he says, well, the Nats did it for a minority and the ANC does it for a majority. But this kind of throwing around apartheid like it's this political football and devaluing the evil of apartheid and just comparing it and throwing it around like it's a plaything is, to me, just one of the worst things that anyone in South Africa can do.
You know what's really worrying about that is that it either means that the DA doesn't understand what apartheid was and doesn't get the full extent to which apartheid was a damaging system of oppression. And there's a quote that says, for those who are privileged, equality feels like oppression. I feel like that's the epitome of that. Just to say that if white people have to now live with the consequences of redress, that somehow this is an affront, this is an attack, this is the equivalent to a crime against humanity, just shows how deep the pathology is. That's a deep pathology. Because at the most basic level, the only reason why race in terms of its legal form still matters in this country is because we need redress. We need to, you don't undo something by pretending it doesn't exist. You undo something by confronting it. We need those categories only because they still matter, because the effects of the apartheid that set them up still matter, are still with us. We still live in apartheid South Africa of one form or the other. And that form is not one that privileges Black people over white people. Absolutely not. It is still a form where the majority of South Africans who are Black are still being subjected to forms of exclusion and marginalization in the way that apartheid meant for it to be. So if you don't care about redress, that's the only reason why you would say something like that, is because you don't understand apartheid, or you really just don't care that redress happens. Anybody who knows anything about trying to fix a system knows that the thing that you need to work on is what was there. You don't try and pretend like that just isn't there anymore and that's going to fix things. You have to say, if there was sexism, we have to then fix sexism by actually addressing it head on, not just pretending it's not there.
Absolutely. Well, as if that wasn't enough, we also heard from former President Zuma over the weekend, a letter that he purportedly wrote to the ANC top six, or a set of briefing notes that were purportedly about his conversations with the top six recently surrounding the Constitutional Court and State Capture Commission scandal, emerged. Who knows from where? Was it from within the ANC top six? Was it from former President Zuma? But again, a lot to think about. How did you react to that letter, and what were some of your thoughts on it?
You know, I try not to react to things that have nothing to do with me. And the ANC's factional battles are just not a priority in my life. I don't care about them. What's going on between Ace Magashula and Jacob Zuma and Cyril Ramaphosa within the ANC is just not our concern. And I believe that we've been distracted for the last 10 to 15 years solidly by the ANC's internal factions and internal battles at the expense of the real issues that this country is dealing with. And yes, people will say, well, you know, what happens within the ANC affects us all, because, you know, if the governing party is not, you know, doing well, then we're all going to suffer for it. The truth is, even when the governing party is doing well, we're suffering. So really, this idea that, you know, the ANC survival is going to determine whether South Africa does well or not, I don't buy it. I think whether the ANC implodes and goes to dust, or whether the ANC rises and is its best self, at this point, we have seen both of those eventualities, and neither one has led to my life or other people's lives being fundamentally different. So to fixate on the ANC is just not something I'm particularly interested in. What does concern me is the idea that you can have people who have as much influence, power, and so much of the state machinery in their hand, also being distracted by navel gazing and by inward looking and by pity parties and about, you know, thinking about their own legacies and who they want to be seen as at the end of this. That concerns me, because if the president of my country has more time to spend, you know, trying to nurse one of his fellow comrades' feelings, then he has time to spend on actually fixing the vaccination crisis that we have. That for me is a problem. We don't have a Jacob Zuma problem in this country. We have an ANC problem. We have a problem of a governing party that is not governing, and that when it does govern, doesn't seem to feel like it needs to do so in a way that is effective, because it has no sense that there'll be accountability at the end of the day. Jacob Zuma is not some sort of thing that just sprung out of nowhere. Jacob Zuma is part of the ANC. He led the ANC for many, many years, almost a decade. If we have a Jacob Zuma problem, it is only because we have an ANC problem. It is all part of the same thing. And unless and until we're focusing on the ANC as a governing party and holding it accountable for what it does or doesn't do, what it fixates on or what it does not fixate on, and we start thinking about how do we make sure that this party that is in government and in governance actually starts to behave right and do things differently, then we're not having a conversation. Conversations about individual characters within the party, irrelevant.
Yeah, I think what's really refreshing to hear is something as clear as that, because it feels to me like the political conversation over the last 3 years, especially in the Ramaphosa era, has just been completely confused, and this view has been propagated, which I'm keen to get your view on, that look, back Cyril Ramaphosa, because he represents the best of the ANC. And in doing so, you kind of get the least worst option. So protect President Ramaphosa, even if you don't agree with the ANC.
See, that view assumes that the pool of leadership in this country and the pool of solutions in this country is limited to the ANC. It's limited to the top 6 or the 80 members of the NEC. And that, we need to be scrambling because this is all we have on offer. I mean, it's exacerbated by the fact that we have opposition parties that are just not options at all in many cases, that are not presenting themselves as viable alternatives that come with a new kind of politics, a new way of engaging us, a new way of thinking about things. So even if we add them to the foray and we say, okay, we're not just talking about inside the ANC, who are the best of the worst options or whatever. The fact is that the majority of South Africans are choosing to abstain from our political system almost altogether because we're having to make decisions about the best of a bad lot of politicians across the board. That's the predicament that we are in. That's the sad state of affairs that we are in, is that all of the politicians who have come into prominence are asking us to choose the best of a bad lot. That's not all of South Africa. That's not where our options begin and end. And the sooner we start to realize that the political parties as they are today and the way in which our politics is set up today and the actors within it are not all that's on offer, the better. We have strong civil society in this country where solutions can come from. We have academia where solutions and leaders can come from. We even have private sector and SMEs and communities and community leaders where solutions and leaders can come from. We do not need to subject ourselves to the ANC.
Well, I recall on Twitter after my interview with Lukhona, check that out over here, that you particularly liked the last part of that interview, as many did, and went so far as to call it an iconic moment from him. And he was essentially saying, look, the time has come, particularly for our generation, to think beyond the status quo. I think he was saying think beyond the ANC and think beyond the status quo, and stop simply accepting that this is all that will ever be available, and actually rise to the occasion and start presenting new alternatives and new pathways. So why did that resonate with you, and what do you think that looks like? Because I think it's one thing to say, cool, we need to do this. I think many people feel that way, but then there's a huge strategic and tactical conversation that has to happen about what's the best way to do this, how do we do it, and what does it look like? And I think that's where the conversation needs to go now.
Sure. So there were a few things that resonated with me in terms of what Lukhona said in that last few minutes. One of them was just the passion with which he spoke. And people have been saying on Twitter in the last few weeks, we're not angry enough, very jokingly. But the truth is, we aren't as passionate about the subject as we should be. There's a lot of just kind of, we're going to hang back. We really don't know where this is going. We're just going to look and see. And there's not enough intention and passion and commitment to not about political party X or political party Y, but about what kind of country we want, and really about a forward look at the kind of country that we want.
Yeah.
And the second thing that resonated, and I'm nobody to speak about future generations of children because I don't intend to have any. I won't do that to you guys. I won't. I promise. But it is important what he said about what do we tell future generations. I'm a youth activist, and so I'm always thinking about the next generation. And what will we tell them about the role that we play in this moment? This is a moment of crisis in our country. This is a moment where we need to think about what happens next. Because if we miss this moment, we're going to just go from election cycle to election cycle, from one political issue to the other, from one commission of inquiry to another. without actually putting together a set of solutions. And so, like I was saying earlier, there are so many places where solutions can be birthed from. Solutions that think about the future. We are a country that fixates on the past. We fixate on it. And actually, the ANC has helped us do that in the forms of somebody like a Jacob Zuma, who will take us into a 4 decades long history about, you know, why his life is bad, or why the country is bad, or what happened in the ANC. We fixate on history in this country, but we don't fixate on the future. What are the kind of things that we want? Even the basic question of what kind of South Africa is the right version of this country? What kind of people do we want to be? We don't answer those questions. We just fixate on either the present or the past, with no consideration about the fact that it's our responsibility to build the future. And you don't build the future through only laying out problems. You build the future by thinking about what the end goal is and what the solutions are. If you know nothing about the journey, of course we're going to be frustrated all the time. Of course we're going to be lose hope and be despondent. Of course people are going to disengage from the process, because we actually don't have a clear view of who we want to be and where we want to go as a country. We have not bought into that. And so it is our responsibility as people who care about this country, as people who have influence, as people who have platforms, to start that conversation. There are people in communities across this country who are having to fight the dailies. Many of us are not having to fight the damn dailies. We're not having to think about whether I'm going to eat tomorrow, the next day, whether my children are going to be clothed. And so we can't ask those people who have to fight the damn dailies and make tomorrow work and the next day to work to think about the future, when the people who have the privilege of not thinking about the damn dailies are not willing to do that. Somebody has to lead. And it has to be people who are willing to take up space, willing to use positions, willing to use their education, willing to use the different platforms that we have to start casting vision.
Yeah, I think there's something very much to what you say about this lack of a vision for the future. And it feels like somehow both things need to happen. There needs to be like a progressive, exciting, innovative, new, fresh vision for the future that appreciates the past and that doesn't seek to ignore the past either. And it feels like we've got stuck over the last 3 decades with a group of political forces which can't do like 2 things at once. Like either you have a group that understands the past and knows how important it is, and that resonates, but then the vision for the future is sketchy at best. Or you have people who may have an interesting vision for the future, but like don't have any understanding of the past. Why is it so hard to just get a political formation, or I don't know, it doesn't have to be a political party or whatever, but that is anti-corruption, that is pro-racial justice, feminist justice, understands oppression across identities, and has a vision for the future? Like we've failed to produce such a formation in 3 decades.
So we've run into an issue that a lot of African countries have certainly faced post-liberation, but even some countries in the so-called developed world, the US, France, where our political system has started being the governing force of the country. So you put in place one political system, one modus operandi, there's a particular party or parties and their political cultures come to govern and come to be the status quo. And we can't see beyond that. So, you know, I speak to young people a lot. And one of the things that young people speak a lot about is the value of the vote. I want us to be brave enough to start having conversations like that. Is voting the right thing to do? is that the right way to organize our society? Or can we envision a society where voting is not the way that it happens now? It's not the way that we do our politics, and there's some other configuration that we use. I want us to be brave enough to not see ourselves as confined to what exists, but start asking ourselves a more fundamental question. What do we need? If you walk into any community in South Africa today, it is very obvious that a lot of the things that are kind of the structures of society that govern society are not necessarily what governs communities. So asking young people to define democracy. A young person once told me that for him, democracy is love. He lives in Kliptown, and the only thing that keeps him able to govern his own life and to do things on his own terms is the fact that he has a community that supports him and loves him, because everything else is broken. Service delivery is broken, voting doesn't inspire him, all of these other things don't work for him. But the love of his community and the kind of solidarity he has in his community, that's democracy for him. That's what he needs, and maybe we need that as a starting point. What do we need to govern ourselves? Because that's all democracy is the government of self. Who, in which ways are we governing ourselves every day? And how do we translate those into systems that work for us? Do the systems that work for us actually work in the daily, or do they only work, when it's Shona and we can see all of the parliamentary procedures? There's a disconnect between what exists formally as structures and what people live in their daily realities. And I'm just interested in focusing on what's happening in people's lives, what they need, and how we use what they're already doing. South Africans aren't sitting around doing nothing. They're making their lives work despite the brokenness of the system. How do we start interpreting those things? How do we start making those things visible, firstly? And how do we start catapulting them into real structural change? I always talk about the fact that one of the unknown forces that keeps this country moving are community leaders. An unpaid workforce that are told they must volunteer their time for the good of the community. But during COVID, that was the workforce that made sure that food parcels went out when the Department of Social Development was still trying to figure out how to operate this existing SASSA system. Those were the people who were trying to figure out how you make COVID-19 work in their communities. When government ward councillors were nowhere to be found, and ward councillors were arguing about whether they're essential services or not. So I'm more interested in those people. I'm interested in the people who are making this country work and the ways in which they're doing it. And I think we're starting to see more and more just a resistance to the system as it is, and a desire for people to actually be engaged and to start participating in a real meaningful way. So for me, that's the starting point.
Well, Tessa, you've left us with a lot to chew on and a lot to think about. Thank you very much for coming on to SMWX. What I will say is now people on Twitter, you can start going to Tessa and asking her to come back on for another interview. So the bullying must now move from me to Tessa. And I think she should be a regular on SMWX, but I'll leave it to Twitter to decide. Thanks so much for coming on, Tessa, and all the best. Ayeye.